Imagine being trapped in a frozen land where the sun barely appears and food might run out before winter ends. How did a simple Viking farmer survive this icy nightmare? In this video, we will explore the ingenious techniques the Vikings used to stay warm, hunt, and even find ways to enjoy themselves in the extreme cold. But there was something even more dangerous than winter itself, something that determined who would survive and who wouldn't. By the end, you will discover the greatest Viking secret to overcoming winter, a strategy that might surprise you. The challenges of a Viking winter in medieval Scandinavia weren't just cold, they were brutal. In some regions, temperatures dropped well below freezing, while daylight hours became incredibly short. For months, the sun barely rose above the horizon, leaving entire villages in a constant twilight. Intense snowstorms buried homes, rivers froze over, and the biting winds made even the simplest tasks a matter of survival. For Viking farmers, these challenges were even more severe. Unlike the jarls, who had abundant supplies and servants to tend to their needs, the carls relied entirely on their own skills to endure. If the autumn harvest was poor or food wasn't properly stored, a harsh winter could mean starvation and death. But lack of food wasn't the only threat. Diseases spread easily inside tightly packed homes where entire families huddled together for warmth. Constant dampness and cold could lead to severe respiratory problems, while frostbite was a very real danger for those who spent too much time outdoors. Additionally, winter brought not only natural hardships but also security risks. As resources became scarce, conflicts could arise, both among neighbors and between rival groups. In some cases, desperation even led to banditry and attacks from starving survivors who saw raiding other villages as their last hope for sustenance. The problem was clear. Without meticulous planning and effective survival strategies, a simple Viking farmer stood little chance of making it through the winter alive. But how did they prepare to face this relentless season? Let's examine the techniques that ensured food and supplies lasted until spring arrived. Preparing for the cold, a Viking farmer's survival during winter began long before the first snowfall. Preparation was a matter of life and death, and every detail had to be carefully planned to ensure that the family and livestock had enough food and shelter to last until spring. The first step was the harvest. During autumn, the carls worked tirelessly to store grains like barley, rye, and oats, which formed the backbone of their winter diet. These grains were ground and turned into porridge and bread, providing a steady source of energy throughout the freezing months. Additionally, root vegetables such as turnips and carrots were carefully buried in the ground or stored in underground cellars to prevent freezing. Meat also needed to be preserved. Since livestock such as pigs and cattle consumed valuable resources, many animals were slaughtered in late autumn. To prevent waste, the meat was smoked, salted, or dried, allowing it to last for months without spoiling. Fish, including herring and cod, underwent the same preservation process to ensure a sufficient protein supply. Another essential resource was firewood. The intense cold made fire indispensable, and Vikings spent much of the autumn chopping and stacking large quantities of wood. Without a sufficient stockpile, nights could become unbearable, and the risk of freezing to death increased dramatically. Beyond food and firewood, houses also needed reinforcement. Roofs were covered with extra layers of straw for better insulation, and any cracks or gaps in the walls were sealed with clay and moss. Many carls even brought their livestock inside during the coldest days, using the animals' body heat to help warm their homes. Preparing for winter wasn't just about stockpiling, it was about strategy. Viking families knew that without careful planning, they could face starvation, disease, or even death. But what happened when the real cold set in? Shelter and heating a Viking farmer's house wasn't just a place to sleep, it was their primary defense against the brutal winter. If poorly built or inadequately maintained, it could mean the difference between life and death. To understand how the Vikings survived the extreme cold, we need to look at the structure of their homes and the clever techniques they used to stay warm. Most Viking houses were made of wood, with walls covered in clay and straw to provide insulation. In regions where wood was scarce, homes were sometimes built using turf blocks, a dense plant material that helped retain heat inside. The roof, usually covered with thatch or grass, not only insulated the house, but also prevented excessive snow buildup. At the center of the house was a large hearth or fire pit, serving as the main source of heat and light. Unlike modern homes, Viking dwellings had no chimneys. The smoke simply rose and escaped through small openings in the roof. This created a smoky environment, but it had an unexpected benefit. The smoke helped preserve meat hanging from the rafters and also kept insects and pests away. To maximize heat inside the home, Vikings used animal skin rugs and thick woolen blankets to cover the floors and walls. Beds were shared among family members, not just for proximity, but because sleeping together helped conserve body heat. Additionally, during the coldest nights, smaller animals like goats and chickens were brought inside, further contributing to the warmth of the home. The positioning of Viking villages was also carefully considered. Whenever possible, they were built in locations sheltered from strong winds, such as valleys or near hillsides. This helped reduce heat loss and made winter slightly more bearable. Even with these strategies, winters were harsh and unforgiving. Surviving depended not only on proper shelter, but also on wearing the right clothing. Next, we'll explore how the Vikings dressed to endure the cold and what materials they used to create garments suited for the harsh winter conditions. Clothing and protection against the cold, protecting themselves from the wands, essential for a Viking farmer's survival. Without modern fabrics or advanced technologies, they had to rely on natural materials and clever techniques to create clothing that could withstand Scandinavia's harsh winters. The foundation of Viking clothing was wool. Wool was the best material available for cold weather, as it retained heat even when wet, and was relatively abundant due to widespread sheep farming. For everyday wear, Vikings used woolen tunics, which could be lined with extra layers during the coldest months. Beneath these tunics, linen shirts helped keep the body dry by absorbing sweat and preventing frostbite. The Carls also wore thick wool trousers, often tied with leather straps to keep the cold from seeping in. On their feet, they used leather boots lined with animal fur, such as sheep or rabbits, to provide adequate insulation. During winter, these boots were often stuffed with extra straw or wool to keep their feet warm. Cloaks were another essential piece of Viking winter attire. Made of heavy wool and often lined with animal fur, these cloaks protected against biting winds and could be fastened with metal brooches. In extreme temperatures, Vikings layered multiple garments, creating an effect similar to modern thermal clothing. Hands and heads also needed protection. Woolen gloves and mittens were common, as well as fur hats that covered the ears and forehead. Some evidence suggests that Vikings also wore wool or leather hoods to shield their faces from the freezing wind. Even with all these protective measures, Viking winters were relentless. A farmer needed not only warm clothing but also a rich and balanced diet to ensure enough energy to endure the cold. Let's take a closer look at how Vikings preserved their food and what typical winter meals consisted of. Food in winter. The intense cold and food shortages made nutrition a matter of survival for Viking farmers. Unlike the Jarls, who had larger food reserves, the Carls had to plan months in advance to ensure their families didn't starve. The basis of the Viking winter diet consisted of long-lasting foods. Grains like barley, rye, and oats were harvested in autumn and stored in barns or underground pits to prevent freezing. They were primarily used to make bread and porridge, providing essential energy to endure the cold. Meat was another crucial part of the diet. In late autumn, many cattle and pigs were slaughtered, as keeping too many animals alive during the winter required valuable resources. The meat was preserved through smoking, salting, or air dry, preventing spoilage. Fish, especially herring and cod, underwent the same process. Vegetables were scarce during the winter. To ensure a supply of nutrients, Vikings stored turnips, onions, and cabbage in underground cellars where temperatures remained stable. Some fruits, like apples and berries, were dried or turned into preserves to last longer. Dairy products were also widely consumed. Since fresh milk spoiled quickly, Vikings produced butter, cheese, and curds, which could be stored for months. Additionally, whey was used in the fermentation of beverages, providing a safe liquid source when drinking water became scarce due to freezing. To keep warm, Vikings consumed large amounts of fat found in meat, dairy, and even fish oils. This fat was essential for providing enough calories to survive the freezing temperatures. Food was rationed carefully, as a longer than expected winter could lead to starvation. However, even in the most difficult months, there was always work to be done. Daily work and routine winter didn't mean rest for Viking farmers. Although field work was impossible due to snow and frozen soil, daily life remained demanding inside the villages. Every day was a battle to keep the house warm, maintain food supplies, and care for the animals. One of the most crucial tasks was tending the fire. Since the cold could be fatal, keeping the hearth burning was a priority. The firewood chopped and stacked in autumn now became essential, and the Carls had to ration it to ensure it lasted until the end of winter. In some villages, night shifts were arranged to make sure the fire never went out. The animals that weren't slaughtered required constant care. Cows, sheep, and goats were kept in stables attached to the houses to benefit from the indoor warmth. Feeding them through months of required meticulous planning, the hay stored in autumn had to be distributed with precision, as miscalculations could lead to livestock dying before spring arrived. Inside the home, work never stopped. Women focused on spinning and weaving, producing clothing for the entire family. The loom was a constant presence in Viking households, and winter was the perfect time to make extra cloaks, socks, and gloves. Meanwhile, men spent time repairing tools, sharpening blades, and ensuring all equipment was ready for the return of fieldwork. Cooking was another key part of daily life. Thick soups and porridge were common, as they helped keep the body warm and made the most of available ingredients. Thyme was also used to ferment beer and mead, not just as a form of escape from the cold, but also as a safe drinking option, since clean water often froze or became unsafe to consume. Despite all this work, the long winter nights could be lonely and difficult to endure. To fight boredom and keep the community's spirit strong, the Vikings had their own ways of entertaining themselves, which we will explore next. Winter superstitions and rituals. Winter was not just a challenging season for the Vikings, it also held deep spiritual significance. The extreme cold, nearly constant darkness, and daily struggle for survival reinforced the belief that supernatural forces were at play. For Viking farmers, rituals and superstitions were not just traditions, but a way to seek protection from the season's dangers. One of the most important winter events was Yule, a festival marking the winter solstice. It was celebrated with feasts, sacrifices, and rituals to ensure the return of the sun in a bountiful spring. Yule was so significant that its traditions were later incorporated into Christmas after the Christianization of Scandinavia. Blots or sacrifices were common during this time. To secure good harvests and protection from disease and evil spirits, Vikings offered food, drinks, and in some cases animal blood to the gods. Freyr, the god of fertility and prosperity, was one of the most revered during these rituals, as his blessing was essential for the new cycle of life. Beyond the gods, Vikings also believed in the presence of spirits and supernatural beings that became more active in winter. One example was the Draugr, undead creatures described in Norse sagas as vengeful spirits that tormented the living. To ward them off, many families lit candles or torches around their homes and avoided certain ominous practices, such as whistling indoors or leaving doors open at night. Interpreting omens was another common winter practice. The way flames flickered, the flight of ravens, or even ice patterns were believed to be signs of good or bad fortune. Some families consulted vulvas, female seers, to understand what the future held. These beliefs and rituals helped Vikings face winter not just physically but also psychologically. The fear of starvation, disease, and death was eased by the certainty that gods and ancestors were watching over those who upheld traditions. Diseases and health in winter, harsh winters were not only a threat due to food shortages and extreme cold, but also because of the increased spread of diseases. With entire families confined in closed homes for months, the risk of infections and illnesses rose dramatically. Without modern medical knowledge, Vikings had to rely on herbs, superstitions, and natural remedies to treat the sick and prevent diseases from spreading. One of the greatest threats was pneumonia, made worse by the cold air and the poor conditions inside smoky homes. The constant inhalation of smoke from fires could irritate the lungs and make people more vulnerable to respiratory infections. To relieve symptoms, it was common to use teas and infusions made from herbs like thyme and nettle, which helped open the airways. Frostbite and hypothermia were also constant dangers. Prolonged exposure to the cold could cause permanent damage to the limbs, sometimes leading to amputation. To prevent this, Vikings applied animal fat to their skin to protect against cracking and frostbite. In severe cases, affected body parts were slowly warmed near a fire to avoid a fatal temperature shock. Gastrointestinal illnesses were another serious problem, especially due to the consumption of stored food that had been kept for months. Poorly preserved or contaminated food could cause severe food poisoning. To treat these issues, Vikings used charcoal powder and plants like chamomile and fennel, which helped digestion and reduced stomach pain. Beyond natural diseases, Vikings also believed that some illnesses had supernatural origins. Sudden sicknesses were often attributed to evil spirits or curses, and in such cases they turned to Volvas, the priestesses and healers of Viking society. These women used herbs, chanted incantations, and performed rituals to drive away harmful influences. Surviving the winter required more than just warmth and food. It also meant avoiding illnesses that could quickly spread in the enclosed living conditions. But when food supplies ran low and hunting became the only option, Vikings had to brave the extreme cold to secure food. Hunting and fishing in winter, even with careful planning and food storage, supplies didn't always last until the end of winter. When stocks began to run low, Viking farmers had no choice but to turn to hunting and fishing, facing the extreme cold to provide food for their families. Hunting in winter was a difficult and dangerous task. The thick snow made movement challenging, and animals were scarcer since many either hibernated or migrated to milder areas. However, some species remained available and became prime targets. Deer, elk, and wild boars were highly valued, as they provided large amounts of meat and fur for clothing and blankets. To hunt them, Vikings used spears, bows, and traps. Hunters often covered their clothing with snow to camouflage themselves and surprise their prey. Smaller animals like hares and birds were another food source. These were easier to catch and provided enough meat to supplement the diet. Additionally, their fur was used to line boots and gloves, helping to retain body heat. Fishing was equally essential, but in winter it became an even greater challenge. Rivers and lakes froze over, requiring Vikings to cut holes in the ice to drop their nets or baited lines. Cod, herring, and salmon were the most common catches and could be eaten fresh or preserved for weeks. In coastal regions, some experienced fishermen even ventured into open waters, braving rough seas to secure a good haul. Winter hunting and fishing required resilience and deep knowledge of nature. A single mistake could cost a hunter their life, either from freezing temperatures or from a dangerous encounter with a wild animal. But survival was not only about overcoming hardships. During the coldest months, Vikings also found ways to keep their spirits high, and entertainment became a vital part of life in their villages. Entertainment and social life in the long winter months were not just a test of physical endurance, but also of mental resilience. With short days, endless nights, and a limited routine, Vikings needed ways to keep morale high and strengthen their bonds within the community. Entertainment and social traditions were essential in making the winter more bearable. One of the most important pastimes was storytelling. Gathered around the fire, family and village members shared sagas and legends about their ancestors, gods, and legendary heroes. These stories were not just entertainment, they also served to pass down knowledge, values, and traditions to younger generations. Games were another popular way to pass the time. Nefatoth, a strategy board game similar to chess, was widely played and required tactical thinking to outmaneuver an opponent. Dice made from bone and carved wooden or stone game pieces were used in various forms of gambling and pastimes. Physical challenges and games inside the house also helped maintain strength and morale. Music and poetry played a crucial role in Viking entertainment. Skalds, the Viking poets and bards, recited epic verses accompanied by lyres and drums. Songs often told stories of battles, lost loves, or even humorous satires about daily life. These performances lifted spirits and reinforced the Vikings' cultural identity. Another key part of Viking social life during winter was beer and mead. Fermented drinks not only helped warm the body, but also served as the centerpiece for celebrations and gatherings. Feasts were held whenever possible, even with limited supplies, as sharing food and drink was a symbol of unity and strength. These activities helped Vikings endure the most difficult months, keeping the community's spirit strong until spring arrived. But what truly ensured Viking farmers' survival wasn't just their resilience or skills. There was a secret behind their ability to withstand the harshest winters, something that set them apart from many other peoples of their time. And now, as promised at the beginning of the video, let's reveal the greatest Viking secret to conquering winter. The greatest Viking secret to surviving winter, from careful preparation to building resilient shelters. The Vikings mastered the art of surviving winter. But what truly ensured their endurance wasn't just their stored food or warm clothing, it was the strength of their community. Unlike many other cultures, the Vikings understood that no one survived alone. Villages worked together, sharing resources, protecting each other, and keeping traditions alive to strengthen their spirits. Winter was not just a physical challenge, but also a test of unity and intelligence. So when we asked at the beginning how a simple Viking farmer managed to survive the freezing winter, the answer lies in preparation, knowledge, and above all, the community around them. This was the true strength of the Vikings, and perhaps it's something we can still learn from them today.